My name's Emily Carter, 33 years old, born and raised in Oregon, now a full-time upholstery designer who can make anything look new again. Car seats, old chairs, even broken hearts. People usually think stories like mine start with a celebration, maybe a glass of champagne or a ribbon-cutting moment. But the night I moved into my very first home, there was no celebration, only the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. Because that night, before I even unpacked a box, I already felt it. Something was off, something I couldn't name yet, but it was waiting for me inside those walls. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. And if you enjoy stories that remind you that peace can be hard won but worth every scar, don't forget to subscribe and help this channel keep bringing more powerful stories like this one. The first house I ever bought stood at the edge of a quiet street in Portland, Oregon. 2 bedrooms, one stubborn porch light that flickered whenever the wind picked up, and a fence that leaned like it had seen too much. It wasn't much to anyone else, but to me, it was proof that the girl who once slept in her car outside a diner could finally afford to call somewhere home. I still remember turning the key that first evening, my hands trembling not from fear, but from disbelief. For the first time in my life, I didn't owe anyone an explanation, a favor, or an apology. The room smelled faintly of paint and dust. I sat down on the floor in the middle of the empty living room and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for over a decade. The quiet wrapped around me, heavy but gentle, like a blanket warmed by the sun. To anyone else, it would have just been silence. To me, it was the sound of survival, the echo that follows years of being ignored, underestimated, and dismissed. It was peace that I had bought, nail by nail, hour by hour. It's funny how people measure success by noise, applause, parties, announcements. I measured mine by stillness. Because for years, silence had been punishment. Growing up, it came after every fight my mother started, and my father refused to finish. It followed me into adulthood, into the cheap apartments where the neighbors fought through the walls, into the jobs where I smiled through exhaustion because quitting wasn't an option. So when I stepped into that quiet little house, I promised myself that this silence would mean something different. This silence would be mine. I remember running my hands along the rough edges of the kitchen counter, tracing the small chips in the paint like they were proof of life. The refrigerator hummed, a little too loudly, as if clearing its throat after years of being ignored in someone else's home. I smiled. I'd fix it later. That was the beauty of this place. Everything broken could be repaired, including me. Most people would have called someone to come over to see it, to take pictures. I didn't. I wanted the first person who crossed that threshold to be me. I turned off my phone, lit a candle, and sat there in the half-darkness listening to the creaks and sighs of a house that didn't yet know my name. I felt a strange mix of triumph and fear. Triumph because I had earned this life with every late night and early morning. Fear because I knew peace is fragile. It has to be defended. You might think that's paranoia talking, but when you've spent your whole life being told you can't, shouldn't, or won't, peace doesn't feel like a reward. It feels like a test. As I walked through each room that night, opening closet doors and checking windows, I whispered to myself, "You're safe. You're home." I wanted to believe it. I really did. The house had quirks. The bathroom door stuck if you closed it too hard. The water heater made a strange gurgling noise whenever it kicked on, and the mailbox leaned forward like it was tired of standing guard for anyone. But I loved every imperfection. It felt honest. No masks, no pretending, just space to breathe. I even put a little pink flamingo in the yard and named her Betty, a ridiculous, bright splash of joy standing guard by the porch. Betty leaned too, but I figured we matched that way. I spent that first night sitting cross-legged on the floor, eating leftover noodles straight from the takeout box. I remember thinking, if this is loneliness, I'll take it. I'd been surrounded by people most of my life who made me feel smaller than silence ever could. That night, for the first time, the quiet didn't shrink me. It expanded me. It made room for hope. But if I had known what was coming, the knock at the door, the invasion of old ghosts, the way my past would soon sit on that same couch, uninvited, I might have savored the quiet a little longer. I might have understood that every story, even one that starts with victory, hides a twist waiting in the dark. Because peace isn't permanent. Sometimes it's just the calm before a storm you didn't know was coming. And that's exactly what this story is about. How the home I built from nothing almost became the stage for the very people who once made me feel like nothing at all. So before I tell you what happened the night I came home and found my parents sitting in my living room, let me ask you something. Question for you. If you finally built a life of peace after years of struggle, and the same people who once broke you showed up wanting to move in, would you A, let them stay, hoping things could be different this time? B, protect your peace, even if it meant closing the door on family? Comment A or B below, because your answer says a lot about what kind of peace you're ready to fight for. People like to say childhood shapes you. What they never mention is how it can also hollow you out, piece by piece, until you learn how to fill yourself back up again. I didn't grow up in a cruel home. There were no slammed doors or broken plates, just a quiet, constant kind of judgment that never stopped humming in the background. My mother, Diane, loved the idea of a perfect family more than she loved the people inside it. My father, Bill, was the kind of man who believed peace meant silence, even if that silence came at someone else's expense. And then there was Ryan, my older brother, her favorite child, the golden boy who could do no wrong. When I was 10, Ryan won a local art competition. Mom threw a backyard party, complete with banners, cupcakes, and matching shirts that read, "Proud of my son." She didn't mean any harm when she told me I could be her little helper. I carried trays, refilled lemonade, smiled for pictures, but not one was of me. It was the first time I realized that invisibility could hurt more than insult. That night, after everyone left, I sat on the porch and listened to the sprinkler hiss across the lawn, thinking how silence can sound like applause you're never invited to hear. That pattern continued for years. Ryan made the basketball team. Mom framed the jersey. I got straight A's in English. She said, "That's nice, but writing won't pay the bills." When I tried to talk about my dreams, design, art, creating things, she'd wave her hand as if brushing away dust. "You should do something practical, Emily, something stable." What she meant was predictable, something she could explain to her friends at church without frowning. Dad wasn't cruel, just indifferent. He existed somewhere between the television and his recliner, always muttering, "We're doing our best," whenever Mom's sharp words go deep. His best usually meant ignoring the tension until it passed, leaving me to patch up my own hurt with the scraps of whatever was left. Sometimes I wondered if he noticed that I stopped talking at dinner, or that my laughter had become a quiet echo of what it used to be. When I turned 16, I got my first job at a small upholstery shop downtown. It smelled of glue, sawdust, and possibility. The owner, Mrs. Harper, was 70 and fierce, with paint-stained hands and a voice that could fill a room. Fixing something broken, she told me once, is an act of faith. You believe it can be whole again, so you try. I didn't know it then, but that sentence would save me later. At home, Mom thought the job was silly. "So you glue fabric for a living?" she'd tease. "That's not a career, Emily. It's a hobby." Ryan had just started college, and every conversation seemed to circle back to him. How proud she was, how expensive tuition was, how she wished I were more like him. She said it kindly, like advice. But kind words can bruise too. By the time I was 19, I'd learned to make myself small. The house I grew up in wasn't loud, but it was heavy, filled with unsaid things that pressed on your chest until you forgot what breathing freely felt like. I remember standing in my bedroom one evening, surrounded by boxes of Ryan's old trophies stacked against the wall, and realizing I didn't belong there anymore. I didn't even exist there, not really. So I left. No fight, no tears, no dramatic exit. Just a note on the kitchen counter that said, "Thanks for the roof." It was the truest goodbye I could manage. I took a bus out of town with a duffel bag, a sewing kit, and $57. I didn't have a plan. I just knew staying would kill something inside me. The first few years were hard. I worked in diners, slept in shared apartments that smelled like burnt coffee, and spent nights sketching design ideas by the light of my phone. But even in the worst moments, I felt freer than I ever had at home. No one compared me to anyone. No one told me to be quieter or neater or more grateful. The silence was mine, and that made it different. Still, the old echoes followed me. The voice that whispered, "You'll never be enough." The fear that one mistake would prove them right. It took me years to understand that surviving isn't the same as healing. I was surviving just fine, paying bills, learning skills, pretending not to care. But inside, I was still the girl on the porch listening to a party meant for someone else. It wasn't until I saved enough money to start taking night classes in interior design that things shifted. For the first time, I met people who saw my talent before they saw my quietness. My instructor, a woman named Marla, looked at one of my chair restorations and said, "You've got an eye for beauty that's been forgotten." I remember going home that night and crying, not because I was sad, but because someone had finally noticed me. That recognition planted something in me, a belief that maybe my worth wasn't defined by who clapped the loudest, but by how deeply I believed in what I was building. I began to find comfort in solitude, to see silence not as punishment, but as a kind of sanctuary. When I worked with fabric, stitching seams by hand, I could hear my thoughts again. I could feel myself returning, one thread at a time. Years later, when people asked why I chose a trade instead of a real career, I'd just smile. Because what they didn't understand was that repairing worn-out material had become a metaphor for my life. Every stitch, every patch, every polish, it all mirrored what I was doing inside. I was learning that I could create beauty out of neglect and strength out of being overlooked. My mother used to say, "Home is where your family is." I used to believe her. But after all those years, I realized something different. Home isn't a place or a bloodline. It's wherever you feel safe enough to rest your heart without apology. So when I finally stood in that Portland house years later, surrounded by boxes and fresh paint, I understood why the silence moved me to tears. Because for the first time, it didn't mean rejection. It meant peace. The same silence that once suffocated me had become my proof of freedom. That's the irony, isn't it? The sounds that once broke you can later become your comfort. The same hush that used to make me feel invisible now reminded me I had survived. I had rebuilt myself from the inside out. People think healing is loud, filled with grand declarations and fireworks of forgiveness. But sometimes healing sounds like nothing at all. Just quiet breathing in an empty room, a heart finally beating without fear. That was the kind of silence I carried with me when I left home all those years ago. The kind that didn't ask for permission. The kind that waited patiently through years of struggle until I was ready to hear what it had to say. And when it finally spoke, it said something I'll never forget. "You were never the quiet one, Emily. You were the one who listened. And now, it's your turn to be heard." After years of drifting from one rented room to another, I finally began to understand the difference between surviving and living. Surviving was paying bills on time, showing up to work, staying out of trouble. Living was quieter, slower. It was waking up one morning and realizing you didn't have to ask permission to be happy. That realization came to me gradually, like light creeping through a half-open curtain. It started the day I decided to build a life of my own, not out of rebellion, but out of sheer exhaustion from trying to fit into everyone else's version of who I should be. Portland became my accidental sanctuary. I moved there on a whim, drawn by its gray skies, coffee-scented streets, and the sense that no one really cared where you came from as long as you showed up and worked hard. I rented a tiny studio above an old mechanic's garage, a space barely big enough for a bed, a sewing machine, and a hot plate. But it was mine. Every morning, I'd wake to the sound of wrenches clinking below and the smell of motor oil seeping through the floorboards. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the first place that didn't echo with someone else's disappointment. I threw myself into work. Upholstery became my language, my form of prayer. I loved the rhythm of it, the way torn fabric surrendered under steady hands, the satisfaction of tightening a seam until it held. The shop where I worked didn't have a name, just a faded sign that read, "Repairs and Restoration." The owner, a retired upholsterer named Grant, gave me the keys after my first month. "If you trust the material," he said, "it'll show you how it wants to be fixed." I never forgot that. Sometimes, when I worked late into the night, I thought about how people weren't much different from furniture. We wear down in the same places, but with care, we can hold again. When I wasn't working, I took community college classes, design, color theory, even basic accounting. The classes were small, mostly older folks starting over, and I liked that. I liked the feeling of not being the only one trying to rebuild a life from scraps. I learned how to run a small business, how to negotiate prices, how to see value in things other people dismissed as broken. And somewhere between the exhaustion and the small triumphs, I started saving for something bigger. By my early 30s, I had enough for a down payment. It wasn't much, just enough for a modest house on the east side of Portland. A 2-bedroom craftsman with peeling paint, a crooked porch, and a yard that looked like it hadn't been mowed in months. To anyone else, it was a project. To me, it was a promise. The first night I walked through it, I felt a kind of electricity in the air, as if the walls were whispering, "We've been waiting for you." Fixing the house became my nightly ritual. I'd come home from work, kick off my boots, and start sanding, painting, repairing. My hands were always sore, but I didn't mind. The rhythm of restoring each room mirrored the way I was rebuilding my own sense of worth, steady, imperfect, but real. I replaced the squeaky hinges, painted the window frames a soft sage green, and installed shelves for all my books, the ones I'd carried from place to place like little anchors of identity. The first thing I bought for the yard was a flamingo, a bright pink lawn ornament I named Betty. She stood proudly in the front garden, a ridiculous splash of color against the faded grass. People walking their dogs would laugh or shake their heads, but I didn't care. Betty was my reminder that life didn't have to make sense to anyone else. She leaned a little to the side, and somehow, that made her perfect. Inside, I added small touches that made the house feel like me. I hung a wind chime near the kitchen window, the kind that made soft, low notes when the breeze passed through. I filled the cabinets with mismatched mugs collected from thrift stores. I planted basil and rosemary in chipped pots on the porch. The smell of soil and fresh paint mixed with the faint hum of the refrigerator, and every sound reminded me, "This is yours, Emily." Every inch of it. Sometimes, after a long day, I'd lie on the floor and stare at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me. I'd imagine my younger self, tired, uncertain, still living out of boxes, watching in disbelief. She wouldn't have believed I'd come this far, that I could live without fear of eviction or disappointment, that peace could exist without asking anyone's permission. Still, even in the comfort of my new space, I couldn't shake certain habits. I locked the doors 3 times every night. I kept an emergency fund tucked inside an old cookie tin in the pantry. I slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound, as though waiting for the past to come knocking. It wasn't paranoia, it was memory. The kind that reminds you how easily security can vanish. But instead of fearing it, I used it as motivation. I reminded myself that what I had was hard-earned and that every ounce of peace required maintenance, just like the house itself. There were moments of pure joy, too. The first morning sunlight poured through the kitchen window and painted the floor golden. The night I cooked a real dinner for myself, roasted vegetables and wine, and ate it at the small table I'd refinished by hand. The Saturday afternoons when I worked on side projects, music playing softly in the background, the scent of sawdust and varnish filling the air. Those were the moments I realized happiness doesn't announce itself. It sneaks in quietly and waits for you to notice. I didn't have many friends then, but the few I did were genuine. A woman named Kara from the community class stopped by sometimes with coffee and conversation about dreams we were both too cautious to say out loud. A retired couple next door, the Langleys, lent me tools and stories about their 50 years together. It felt strange, having people care without conditions. It felt like warmth I didn't know I'd been missing. Still, most nights it was just me in the house, and I liked it that way. There was a comfort in the routine. The hum of the ceiling fan, the creak of the floorboards, the smell of fresh coffee every morning. It felt stable, safe. Like I had finally stepped out of someone else's shadow and built a world that belonged entirely to me. I didn't know it then, but those small, ordinary moments were the calm before everything changed. I didn't know that the same quiet I had built so carefully could be disrupted by a knock on the door, or that the peace I thought I'd secured could be tested in ways I never expected. But that's the thing about rebuilding a life. You learn to fix what breaks, to tighten the loose screws, to trust that even if the past finds its way to your doorstep, you're strong enough now to protect what's yours. I didn't know how much I would need that strength soon, but the house was teaching me every day, and I was listening. It happened on a Thursday night, one of those long work days that felt endless but satisfying. The air outside was cold enough to sting, and all I wanted was to get home, kick off my boots, and eat the leftover noodles I'd promised myself I'd finally finish. My hands smelled faintly of fabric glue and cedar polish from the shop, and the thought of a quiet evening felt like a reward. The streets of Portland glowed soft under the rain, traffic lights blinking through mist, the city exhaling after a long day. By the time I turned into my street, I was humming to myself, thinking about how good it felt to have something steady, predictable, mine. But as soon as I pulled into the driveway, something felt wrong. It wasn't the kind of wrong you could see, just the kind that prickles your neck, a whisper that says, "You're not alone." The porch light was on, but dimmer than usual, flickering like it was hesitating. I frowned. I was sure I'd turned it off that morning. Then I saw it, an empty space where my pink lawn flamingo Betty usually stood. Her absence hit me harder than I expected. Betty wasn't just decoration. She was a reminder of joy, of claiming space in a world that had always told me to take up less of it. At first, I told myself maybe the wind had knocked her over. Portland's storms could be rough, and Betty leaned like she'd been through worse. But when I got out of the car and looked around, she wasn't by the porch, or near the bushes, or anywhere at all. The yard was still, damp, silent, except for the faint sound of rain tapping against the windows. My stomach tightened. Something was off. I climbed the steps, balancing my toolbox in one hand and a paper bag of takeout in the other. The front door looked normal, maybe a little smudged near the handle, but when I turned the key, it didn't stick the way it usually did. The latch clicked too easily. My breath caught. I pushed the door open, and before my brain could make sense of what I saw, my body froze completely. My parents were sitting on my couch. Not just sitting, comfortable, casual, as if they'd lived there for weeks. My mother, Diane, had a mug of my tea in her hand, the one that said, "Property of the woman who pays the mortgage." My father, Bill, had his shoes off, feet propped on my coffee table, flipping through a magazine like it was his own living room. For a moment, I thought I must have walked into a dream or the wrong house. "What?" I started, my voice catching in my throat. "Oh, Emily." Mom's voice lit up as if I'd come home for Thanksgiving. "You're home earlier than I thought. We figured you wouldn't mind." I blinked, still standing in the doorway. "Mind what?" She gestured around like a realtor showing off a property. "Making this a family home again. You've done such a lovely job with it. It feels right that we're all here together." My father looked up, completely unfazed. "You really fixed the place up nice," he said, like a compliment would make sense of all this. "Your brother would be proud." Ryan, of course, they mentioned him. "Where's Betty?" I asked quietly, because somehow that was the only question I could form. Mom waved her hand. "That tacky bird? I put it in the garage. We don't need to look like a trailer park." My chest tightened. "You move things?" "Well," she said, her tone turning defensive, "we had to make room. Ryan's girlfriend is using the guest room. She's studying for her realtor exam and needs somewhere quiet. You weren't using it, right?" I set the takeout on the counter and stared at them. "You moved her in?" Dad nodded. "Just until she passes her exam. You're not even home that much, sweetheart. What's the big deal? Family shares. Family shares." The same phrase my father used when he lent out my bike as a kid, when my mother took money from my savings for groceries and never paid it back. Family shares, code for you owe us your boundaries. "How long have you been here?" I asked, my voice steady even as something inside me began to shake. "Oh, just since yesterday," Mom said, smiling proudly, as if she'd done me a favor. "We cleaned a bit, rearranged. You'll thank us later. The place needed a woman's touch." I looked around. My books were stacked differently. The framed photo of me from trade school was missing, and my couch, the one I'd hauled up the stairs alone, was draped with Mom's favorite throw blanket. Everything about the room felt foreign, invaded. "Why didn't you call first?" I asked quietly. Dad shrugged. "We didn't want to bother you. You've been so busy, and we figured it's time we all stayed close again. You know, as a family." The way he said it, as a family, made my skin crawl. It wasn't an invitation, it was a claim. Mom smiled, taking another sip from my mug. Isn't this nice, Bill? All of us under one roof again. It's like when the kids were little. No, I said. It came out flat, almost too calm. It's not. They both looked at me then, like I'd broken some rule by refusing to play along. Mom tilted her head, her smile tightening. Emily, don't be dramatic. You always overreact. Something flickered inside me, years of silence, of being told I was too sensitive, too serious, too much. I picked up my keys and set them gently on the counter, forcing myself to breathe evenly. Where's your car? I asked. Dad grinned. Out front. Moved yours to the curb to make space. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Instead, I started to laugh quietly, a sound that startled even me. It wasn't amusement. It was disbelief, sharp and bitter. They had taken over my home as if it were an unspoken right, rearranged my world without even asking. Mom misread the laugh as surrender. See? I knew you'd come around. It's about time this house felt alive. Alive. That word echoed in my head, cruelly ironic. This house had been alive before they arrived. It had been mine. The quiet, the peace, the sense of safety, it all evaporated in a single evening. I opened the fridge to steady myself. Inside, my food had been replaced with diet meals and almond milk. My brand of coffee was gone, replaced by theirs. They'd restocked my home like it was their own pantry. Mom's voice followed me, soft but firm. You should be grateful, Emily. Not everyone has family who wants to be close. I turned slowly, met her eyes, and for the first time in my life, I didn't shrink. You didn't come here to be close. I said, you came here to take. Her smile faltered, just slightly. That's not fair. Neither is moving into someone's home without asking. She scoffed, waving me off. You're overreacting. It's all paperwork anyway. Family doesn't need permission slips. But as she said that, my mind clicked into clarity. I had learned enough from years of patching things that broke. Some cracks you can't fill. Some structures aren't meant to hold weight. So I smiled, matching her tone. You're right, Mom. I don't mind. Her face brightened, unaware that the words meant something entirely different to me. Because at that moment, as I stood there surrounded by the ghosts of my past, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I didn't know how yet. But I knew this. They had taken the house physically, but legally, spiritually, it was still mine. And by the time they realized what that meant, it would already be too late. That night, after finding my parents settled into my living room like permanent fixtures, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan that turned too slowly to drown out the echo of my mother's voice drifting through the thin walls. She was humming to herself, maybe making tea in my kitchen, the same way she used to when I was a teenager, and she wanted to remind everyone whose house it really was. My father's low murmur followed, something about finally feeling at home. The words stung. Because for me, home had always been a promise I had to build from scratch. A promise I'd spent years keeping. And now, just like that, they'd turned it into a possession to be claimed. By morning, the house didn't even smell like mine anymore. The faint scent of cedar polish and fabric glue had been replaced with my mother's floral candles. My father's coffee cup sat on the counter, his jacket on my chair, his shoes by the door. Every object screamed intrusion, and yet they both looked so calm, so entitled, as if they were the ones doing me a favor. I made coffee, forcing my movements to stay steady, but my chest was tight. It wasn't anger I felt. It was something quieter, heavier, like grief. The loss of my peace. The loss of boundaries I'd fought to build. When Mom noticed me in the kitchen, she smiled like nothing had happened. I washed your sheets, dear. You're welcome. She said it with such pride, as though her violation of my privacy was an act of love. My father barely looked up from the newspaper. We'll chip in for groceries soon, he said casually, like we were roommates instead of unwilling hosts and squatters. I wanted to tell them to leave. I wanted to shout until the house itself shook. But something in me stopped. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the realization that shouting at people who never listened was like whispering into the wind. So instead, I nodded. Thanks, I said softly. My voice didn't even tremble. That scared me more than anything. That afternoon, while they were out shopping for a few things to make the house more comfortable, I called Grace Holloway. Grace wasn't just my lawyer. She was a friend, someone who had helped me close the deal on the house and had insisted on setting up a living trust. She'd told me back then, "You never know who'll show up at your door when they see you've made it." At the time, I thought she was being overly cautious. Now, her foresight felt prophetic. When she answered, her voice was calm, measured, the way only lawyers who have seen the worst can sound. "Emily, talk to me. What happened?" I explained everything. How they'd moved in without asking. How they'd changed things. How my father had used my address for his mail. Grace didn't interrupt once. When I was done, she said quietly, "They've crossed more than one legal line. But I need to ask, do you want to handle this fast or handle it right?" "Right," I said after a moment. "I want it to be right." There was a pause. Then the sound of papers shuffling on her end. "You made the trust's ownership transfer official 2 months ago. That means the property technically belongs to the trust, not you personally. That's good. It gives you leverage. I can file a lock change order and send a formal notice of unauthorized occupation." The words sounded cold and technical, but to me they were oxygen. For the first time since Thursday night, I felt the ground solid beneath me again. Grace met me at her office that same evening. Her space was tidy, minimalist, but warm, soft amber light and the smell of leather-bound books. She wore her usual dark blazer, hair pulled back, calm as stone. When she looked at me, her expression softened. "You're handling this better than most people would." "I'm not sure I'm handling it at all," I admitted. "I'm just tired." She nodded. Boundaries exhaust people who were raised to believe they shouldn't have any. But that's why you built this trust, remember? You didn't build it to keep others out. You built it to protect your peace when they inevitably came knocking. Her words struck a chord deep inside me. All the years of feeling like I had to justify my existence came rushing back. Only this time I realized I didn't have to explain anything anymore. I'd already done the work. I'd earned the right to protect myself. Grace slid a few documents across the table. "I'll file the notices tonight. By Monday morning, you'll have full legal grounds to change the locks. No confrontation needed." I nodded, signing the papers carefully, my hands steady. Each stroke of ink felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen. When it was done, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. Driving home, I noticed the city lights reflecting in puddles along the street. Everything looked ordinary again, deceptively peaceful. But peace is never passive. It takes constant tending, like a fragile garden that weeds keep trying to reclaim. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had a plan. Inside, my parents were back, unloading bags from the store. My mother had bought new curtains, cheap lace with tiny flowers. "Aren't they cute?" she asked. "Much cozier than those plain things you had." My father grinned. "I got us a new coffee pot, too. Yours was ancient." I smiled politely, the way one does when entertaining guests who've overstayed their welcome. "Looks nice," I said. I kept my tone even, my movements unhurried. If they sensed my calm, they might mistake it for compliance. That's exactly what I wanted. That night, after they went to bed, I walked through the house slowly. Every corner felt different now, tainted by their presence, but beneath it all, it was still mine, or at least the trust's. The ownership documents were already on record. Legally, I didn't need to argue. I just needed time. Time and silence. I sat down at the dining table and started writing a list. What I'd need to replace, what would stay, what repairs to finish once they were gone. The act of writing steadied me. My grandmother used to say, "Order your thoughts before you speak your truth." I smiled at the memory. She'd been the only one in the family who believed I could build something on my own. I wish she could see me now, not broken, not begging, just preparing. Over the next 2 days, I played the part perfectly. When my mother complained about how quiet I was, I told her I was just tired from work. When my father joked about turning the garage into his workshop, I laughed and said, "That's a great idea." Every smile I gave them was armor. Every calm word, a shield. They had no idea what was coming. On Sunday night, as they settled in front of the TV, I stood in the doorway and watched them. For a fleeting second, I saw the outlines of who they used to be, the people I once desperately wanted to please. Then I remembered the years of silence, the comparisons, the erasure. That longing vanished. I went upstairs and packed a small overnight bag, just in case. Monday morning would come early. The locksmith would arrive at 9. Grace would meet me at 10 to finalize the documentation. Everything was set. Before bed, I checked the locks. 1, 2, 3, and looked out at the yard. The porch light flickered faintly, the same way it had that night I came home and found them there. But this time, the light didn't feel weak. It felt steady, waiting. It was the kind of light that doesn't beg to be bright. It just burns quietly, stubbornly through the dark. And as I turned away, I thought, let them sleep peacefully tonight, because tomorrow, peace would belong to me again. Monday morning arrived, with the kind of stillness that feels like the pause before thunder. The sky was the color of wet concrete, and the air hung heavy, filled with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. I woke early, earlier than I needed to, not because I was nervous, but because my body already knew something irreversible was about to happen. I moved through the house quietly, making coffee, folding the blanket on the couch, small rituals that steadied me, grounding me in what was still mine, at least for a few more hours. Down the hall, I could hear my parents talking in hushed tones, the familiar sound of my mother's disapproval layered with my father's half-hearted attempts to smooth things over. The same melody I had grown up hearing. I didn't need to listen to the words to know the rhythm. She complained, he deflected, and the cycle continued. This time, though, their voices no longer sank into me. They floated over the surface, unable to penetrate. At 9 sharp, there was a soft knock on the door. I already knew it was Grace. She was punctual to the minute, the kind of woman who never needed to raise her voice to command a room. When I opened the door, she gave me a small, measured smile. "You ready?" she asked. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She was dressed in her usual black blazer, a folder tucked neatly under her arm. Behind her stood a man with a toolbox, Luis, the locksmith she had recommended. He gave me a polite nod before heading toward the door frames to assess the locks. My mother appeared in the hallway, her expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. "Emily," she said, drawing out my name like a warning, "who are these people?" Grace turned toward her, calm but firm. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter. I'm Grace Holloway, legal representative for the Carter Living Trust, the entity that owns this property." My mother blinked, clearly thrown by the formality. "What are you talking about? This is Emily's house?" "It was," Grace replied evenly. "The title was transferred into a living trust several months ago. My client retains management rights, but the property is no longer under her personal ownership." My father stepped into the living room, his robe tied loosely, his face red with irritation. "This is ridiculous," he said, pointing at me. "She's our daughter. You can't just talk to us like we're strangers." Grace didn't flinch. "Legally, you are strangers in the context of property law, sir. Neither of you are registered occupants, nor do you have any documented right to reside here. The trust has issued an eviction notice, effective immediately." The words hung in the air like a sharp wind cutting through the room. My mother's mouth fell open. "Eviction? You can't evict family." Grace met her gaze, unbothered. "The law doesn't recognize familial exceptions for unauthorized occupancy. The locksmith will be changing the locks this morning. You have until he's finished to remove your belongings." For a long moment there was silence. Then my mother's voice broke it, trembling but defiant. "You wouldn't do this to us, Emily. You're not this kind of person." I took a slow breath, the smell of coffee grounding me. "You're right," I said quietly. "I wasn't. I used to bend until I disappeared. I used to believe that family meant letting people cross every line, even when it cost me my peace. But I learned something in this house. I learned that love without respect isn't love. It's control." Her face twisted, first in disbelief, then in something that looked like pity. "You're being manipulated," she said, her voice sharpening. "This woman is putting ideas in your head." Grace stayed silent. I didn't. "The only person manipulating me," I said, "is the one who moved into my home and called it hers." My father rubbed his temple, exasperated. "Let's all calm down," he muttered. "We can work something out." I looked at him then, not with anger, but with a kind of tired clarity. "You've spent your whole life working things out by ignoring what's right in front of you. Not this time." He sighed heavily, then turned to Grace. "You can't expect us to just leave. We have nowhere to go." Grace's tone softened slightly, but her words remained firm. "There are relocation resources listed in the notice you received. We recommend temporary housing arrangements while you secure a new place." Mom's eyes narrowed. "So that's it?" You just throw us out like trash? I shook my head. No, I'm giving you back responsibility for your own lives. I carried it long enough. She looked at me for a long moment, searching my face for something familiar, something that might suggest I'd relent. But the woman she remembered, the one who flinched, who apologized, was gone. Luis reappeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. Locks are ready to switch whenever you give the word, he said. Grace nodded. You may begin. The metallic click of tools echoed through the hallway. My mother flinched at the sound. My father muttered under his breath, pacing. I stood still, arms crossed loosely, my breath slow and even. Mom finally broke the silence. This is cruel, she whispered. We just wanted to be close to you again. I met her eyes. You wanted access, not closeness. Those aren't the same thing. Something inside her seemed to crack then. Her voice softened, trembling. We made mistakes, Emily, but we're still your parents. I know, I said, and for the first time, I let my voice carry the full weight of the truth. And I'll always be your daughter. But that doesn't mean you get to rewrite the rules of my life every time you feel entitled to it. She didn't answer. She just stood there, watching as Luis replaced the last lock. The sound of the new bolt sliding into place was final, almost ceremonial. When it was done, Grace handed me a new set of keys. They gleamed in my palm, small, ordinary things, but they felt heavy with meaning. My father was the first to move. He gathered his jacket, muttering something about dignity, while my mother lingered, her hand resting on the back of the couch like she couldn't quite let go. I hope you're proud of yourself, she said finally, her voice brittle. I am, I said. For once, I am. They left without another word. The front door shut behind them, soft but absolute. Grace glanced at me, her expression unreadable. You okay? I nodded slowly, looking around the now empty living room. I think so. It feels strange, like the air's been cleared but heavier at the same time. That's what freedom feels like sometimes, she said. Uncomfortable, but honest. When she left, I stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet. It wasn't the same silence I'd first fallen in love with when I bought the house. It was heavier, threaded with loss and relief and something new, power. Outside, the rain finally started. It hit the windows softly, steady, like applause from the universe itself. And in that moment, I realized that peace doesn't come from being untouched. It comes from surviving the touch and still choosing to stand. That night, after my parents walked out and the sound of the rain softened to a hush, I didn't feel the rush of victory I thought I might. The house was quiet again. Yes, but it was a different kind of quiet, one that carried both relief and mourning. I had taken my life back, but there was still the ache of what I'd lost in the process. Not the family itself, but the hope that one day they might have loved me the way I needed them to. I stood in the middle of the living room, the faint smell of my mother's perfume still clinging to the air, and felt something inside me release. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the slow, trembling surrender of trying to fix something that had never been whole. Grace stayed for a while after they left. She poured us both tea and didn't say much, which was exactly what I needed. She had that rare kind of empathy, the kind that understands silence is its own form of conversation. When she finally stood to go, she handed me a small envelope. This came to my office for you, she said, addressed to the trust. It looked personal, so I didn't open it. I turned it over in my hands, noticing the neat cursive handwriting. My grandmother's handwriting. My throat tightened. She had passed a year earlier, and I hadn't expected to ever see her words again. The envelope was postmarked only a few weeks before her death. I slid a finger under the flap and unfolded the letter slowly, afraid it might fall apart from age. Emily, it began, if this finds you, I hope it means you finally built something of your own. I don't know the details, but I do know how your parents can be. Remember, my dear, you don't have to shout to be strong. You just have to stop asking for permission to stand tall. I reread that line 3 times, my eyes blurring until the words melted into each other. My grandmother had always been the one person in my family who saw me, not as an accessory to someone else's success, but as a whole person trying her best. I could almost hear her voice in the soft scratch of ink. She had been gentle, but never weak. She'd known how to draw boundaries long before anyone had a name for them. Grace touched my arm lightly. She sounds like she knew you better than most. She did, I said, folding the letter carefully. She'd probably tell me to stop standing here feeling guilty and start enjoying what I fought for. Grace smiled. Then maybe you should listen to her. After she left, I walked through the house slowly, room by room, reclaiming the space with quiet intention. I threw open the windows to let the air move, replaced the floral candles with the cedar-scented ones I loved, and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. Not to drink, but to fill the air with something that smelled like me. I took down the lace curtains my mother had hung and folded them neatly before placing them by the door. It wasn't spite, it was ceremony. Each small act felt like lighting a candle in a dark room, a ritual of reclaiming. In the kitchen, I found one of my father's half-empty mugs and set it in the sink. I watched the water rinse away the faint trace of his fingerprints. The sound of it was soft, almost meditative. It struck me then how strange grief can be, how it lingers not in the big moments, but in the ordinary gestures of letting go. I stepped outside for air. The rain had stopped, leaving the street glistening under the yellow glow of the lampposts. Betty, my flamingo, was still standing in the yard, leaning slightly to one side, her pink feathers gleaming wet. Somehow she'd survived all of it. The storm, the intrusion, the chaos. I smiled, walking over to straighten her. I found a small zip tie in the garage and fastened her securely to the porch rail. "You're not going anywhere," I whispered. "Not this time." For the first time in weeks, the night didn't feel heavy. The air smelled clean, washed. Inside, I wrapped myself in a blanket and read my grandmother's letter again. Her words echoed softly through the house. "You don't have to be loud to be strong." I whispered it out loud, testing the truth of it against the quiet. She was right. Strength doesn't always look like confrontation or anger. Sometimes it's the stillness after the storm, the decision to keep your peace even when the world tries to take it. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the window in thin golden lines. It felt like the house was exhaling with me. I made breakfast for one, real breakfast this time. Eggs, toast, orange juice. The simple kind of meal that doesn't demand anything but appreciation. I ate slowly, tasting every bite. It felt like I was feeding a part of myself that had gone hungry for years. Later that day, I gathered up what my parents had left behind, a sweater, a few photographs, a grocery list in my mother's handwriting, and placed it all in a cardboard box. I labeled it "to return" and left it by the front door. There was no anger in the gesture, just closure. They could keep their things, but not my space, not my peace. When the doorbell rang that afternoon, I startled slightly, old habits resurfacing. But it was only a courier dropping off paperwork from Grace, the final confirmation that the eviction had been processed, the property fully cleared. Attached was a note in her neat handwriting. "It's done. Go live." I set the papers aside and sat on the porch steps, watching the neighborhood come to life. Kids rode their bikes down the wet pavement, dogs barked from open yards, and a breeze rustled the trees overhead. It was all so ordinary, yet it felt extraordinary to me, this simple act of belonging to a place that was finally entirely mine. That evening, I decided to mark the moment, not with celebration, but with stillness. I turned off my phone, dimmed the lights, and sat by the window, watching the last streaks of daylight fade. I thought about my grandmother, about Grace, about every version of myself that had gotten me here. The scared girl who left home at 19, the tired woman who stitched car seats to pay rent, the one who dared to buy a house even when no one believed she could. They all existed in me still, layered like fabric, each one holding the others together. For years, I had confused forgiveness with letting people back in. But now I understood. Forgiveness is simply letting go of the hope that the past could have been different. I didn't need my parents to apologize to find peace. I just needed to stop waiting for them to see me. As the stars began to appear, I whispered a quiet goodbye, not to them, but to the part of myself that still wanted to fix everything. That part had done her best. She could rest now. Before I went to bed, I looked around the living room one last time. The silence had changed again. It wasn't the uneasy quiet of intrusion or the hollow quiet of loneliness. It was soft, full, alive. It was mine. And for the first time in my life, I understood what my grandmother meant. Strength doesn't shout. It breathes. It forgives without returning. It closes doors gently and walks away without leaving anger behind. That night, I slept deeply, wrapped not in blankets, but in peace. In the months that followed, the house grew into something entirely new. The air felt lighter, rooms brighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled after years of holding their breath. I didn't rush to fill the space they left behind. I let it breathe. I let myself breathe. Every morning, sunlight would pour through the kitchen window and spill across the counter where my mother once sat sipping tea she never asked to make. I'd stand there, coffee in hand, and think, not with regret, but with gratitude, for the peace I had fought to reclaim. Healing, I learned, doesn't come in waves of joy or dramatic epiphanies. It comes in moments so ordinary you almost miss them. Hanging new curtains, repainting the door a color that feels like your heartbeat, watering the herbs on the windowsill. It's in how you take back your own time, your own mornings, your own silence. I didn't wake up one day and feel healed, but I began to feel something better, steady, free, whole. The quiet, once sharp and unfamiliar, had turned into a companion. I no longer filled it with worry or guilt. Instead, I filled it with music, laughter, the hum of work tools from my studio. The life I was building wasn't loud, but it was alive. It started small, just me, repairing seat cushions and vintage chairs in the garage, the smell of leather and varnish blending with Portland rain. Word of mouth spread quickly. People loved that my work wasn't about perfection, but restoration. "You don't make things new," one customer told me. "You make them honest." That stuck with me. I decided to carry it forward. By spring, I'd saved enough to rent a commercial space, a modest 2-bay workshop with tall windows and room for growth. I named it Stitch and Soul. The sign, simple and clean, went up one drizzly morning in April. Standing beneath it, I felt a quiet pulse in my chest, the same kind of still pride I'd felt the day I bought my house. Except this time, it wasn't about ownership. It was about purpose. I filled the space with everything I loved: rolls of fabric stacked by color, jars of buttons sorted by shape, and an old record player humming jazz in the background. I hired 2 women who reminded me of earlier versions of myself, steady hands, uncertain hearts. One was newly divorced, the other starting over after losing her job of 20 years. They didn't need pep talks, they needed space to start again. So I gave them that. We worked quietly most days, but every now and then, laughter would spill out from the workshop, bouncing off the metal walls like music. The first week, I brought Betty, the flamingo, and set her just outside the door. She stood bright and unapologetic, pink against the gray Portland sky. A few passers-by smiled at her. One even said, "She looks like she belongs here." And she did. So did I. The shop became more than work. It became community. People started dropping by just to talk. A mechanic from next door would bring coffee in the mornings. A retired teacher donated old fabric rolls. Sometimes on quiet afternoons, I'd find myself telling bits of my story, how this all started from a rented garage, how I learned to mend what others threw away. But I never spoke about my parents. Not out of bitterness, but because they no longer defined the story. The moment I stopped needing them to understand me was the moment I became free from their shadow. Still, the past has its ways of reaching out. One afternoon, as I was closing up the shop, a letter slipped through the mail slot. No stamp, no return address. My heart tightened the moment I saw the familiar handwriting. I knew it was from my mother. Inside was a single photograph. Ryan's birthday party, 20 years ago. In it, he was blowing out candles while I stood in the background, half hidden, smiling faintly. My name had been written on the corner of the cake, crossed out in thick marker. Taped to the photo was a note in her hand. "We made mistakes, but you didn't have to be so cruel." I stared at it for a long time. Then I folded the photo gently and placed it in a drawer, not out of anger, but because some memories don't need burning. They just need boundaries. For years, I thought closure would come when they apologized. But standing there in my workshop, surrounded by the hum of the sewing machine and the soft rhythm of rain against glass, I realized closure had already come the moment I stopped waiting. That weekend, I invited my team and a few close friends for a small cookout behind the shop. Nothing fancy: paper plates, burgers, a Bluetooth speaker playing soul music. We laughed until our sides hurt. Grace stopped by, late as usual, with a bottle of wine and that knowing smile she always wore when she saw me thriving. "So this is Stitch and Soul," she said, glancing around. "I can see both." We clinked glasses. For the first time, I wasn't celebrating survival. I was celebrating living. At one point, someone asked, "Do you ever talk to your family anymore?" I paused, looked around at the faces of people who had shown up, who stayed, who listened. Then I smiled. "Only in prayers," I said, "the quiet kind." The group laughed softly, not in mockery, but in understanding. Because they all knew, sometimes the family you build has nothing to do with blood. It's made of people who see you, who meet you where you are, who stay when things get quiet. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat alone outside the shop. The city hummed softly in the distance, the air cool and still. Betty stood by the door, her shadow long under the streetlight. I thought of the younger me, the girl who left home with $57 and no plan, the woman who built peace plank by plank, the one who finally learned that silence could be love's truest form. I didn't need to forgive anyone to feel whole. I didn't need to rewrite the story to make it softer. I only needed to honor the truth, that peace is not a gift others hand you. It's something you create, protect, and carry forward. When I finally stood to lock up, I turned the key slowly, feeling the solid click beneath my hand. It reminded me of that morning months ago when Luis changed the locks at my house. That same sound, final, steady, right. Except this time, it wasn't about keeping anyone out. It was about knowing what was worth letting in. As I walked home, the city lights shimmered against the wet pavement, and I realized how beautiful ordinary life can be when you stop fighting the past and start trusting the present. I thought of my grandmother's words, "You don't have to be loud to be strong." She was right. Strength isn't the fire that burns everything down. It's the quiet ember that keeps glowing long after the storm has passed. When I reached my house, I paused at the door, listening to the soft hum of the world around me, the whisper of rain, the creak of the porch steps, the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I opened the door, stepped inside, and smiled. The silence that greeted me wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything I had built, everything I had become. And for the first time, I didn't think of the past or the people who once lived in this space. I thought of the life waiting for me beyond it, the one I had chosen, created, and earned. I closed the door gently behind me, locking it not out of fear, but with gratitude. Because peace, once fought for and protected, becomes something more than safety. It becomes home. Looking back on Emily Carter's story, it wasn't just about a woman reclaiming her house. It was about a woman reclaiming herself. From the quiet girl who once hid behind other people's expectations to the woman who learned to build, protect, and own her peace, Emily's journey reminds us that freedom often begins where fear ends. She didn't seek revenge, and she didn't destroy anyone. Instead, she drew a boundary so strong it became a blueprint for a new life. The home she bought, the one her parents tried to claim, became more than property. It became proof that healing is possible, even after years of being unseen. Through patience, wisdom, and quiet determination, she transformed her silence from a weapon others used against her into a sanctuary she created for herself. The lesson in Emily's story is universal. Peace is not found in permission, but in self-trust. You don't need validation to begin again. You don't need others to apologize before you let go. Sometimes letting go isn't about turning your back on family. It's about turning toward the person you were always meant to be. Boundaries are not walls. They're doors with locks you get to choose when and how to open. When we learn that saying no is not cruelty but clarity, we begin to build a life that truly fits. Now let's see what you think. If you were in Emily's place, would you A. Allow your family to stay, hoping they might change? B. Protect your peace and set firm boundaries, even if it meant closing the door on them? Comment A or B below. I'm really curious to see what you would do in her situation. And tell me your thoughts. Do you believe peace should always come before family, or can they coexist? Share your opinion in the comments so we can all reflect together. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt, thought-provoking stories that remind us how powerful it is to protect our peace.